Welcome back to the channel. Today's lesson is called Syncing the Inner and Outer Map. So first of all, what is the outer map? Well, the outer map is simply the position of our body, arms, and racket in space as we go about our swinging process. And we're going to pay particular attention in this outer map to the part of the movement map that we haven't given as much attention to, which is the wind-up into the slot. We've had 3 or 4 major lessons about the release, as we should be, as that's the most important part of the swing, with the slinging idea and the catching of the wave idea. All these things extremely important, the most important. But also I've heard from a lot of students that they're having trouble with this wind-up phase. And why is that? Well, it's basically because the racket sort of disappears from our viewpoint as we take it around our body in the wind-up, especially if we do it right. The racket is way back here, dropped behind us, and we sort of lose our orientation to what's happening back there. So that's where it'll be our special focus on the syncing of the inner and outer map today. So if we look at the first phase of this wind up, the take back to the handbrake position, and we look at 3 of our big 3 GOAT forehand candidates, Djokovic, Federer, and Nadal, we see each of them do it in a different way. And, we see Djokovic back up here, we see Federer more like this, and we see Nadal sort of like this. So we have to ask ourselves, why are these positions different? Why are they seemingly doing it differently? So that's where we need to go into the inner map idea. In this topspin series, we've had a lot of slow motion videos where we've seen the GOAT candidates, go through all the phases of the swing, special emphasis, of course, on the release. But we've also seen our fair share of takebacks. And we've also turned on the new tracing technology where we can see more of the hand path and the racket path as we go through this spiraling swing, and we've got a much more clearer concept of this outer map and exactly where it goes and how it works. But as I've said all along, in order to understand the movement map, we have to understand the principles and feels. That's the inner map. So in this series of lessons on the forehand, topspin forehand, we've been working our way through the principles and feels, the major principles and feels of this topswing movement process. And for those of you who are just joining us in the series in the last 2 or 3 weeks, welcome. All of these movement map lessons for the topspin forehand are numbered in sequence, starting from 1, now we're in 11. They're in the playlist of the channel. You can go back, and I encourage you to go back and review those and get caught up as we move forward. And you can see in the background of this slide how many major principles we've covered over the last several lessons. Tremendous quantity of material and depth of material. And it's not to say that you have to, as you watch these things for the first time, to get every single idea. They're sort of designed so you can go back. If you have problems in certain areas, you can go back and rewatch the video and pick up more details. You don't necessarily have to rewatch the whole thing. However, it gives you sort of a baseline where to go to address these issues. And I know a lot of you are saying, that's fine. I like the topspin forehand stuff, but I have other problems in my tennis game, my serve and my backhand in particular. When are you going to get to those? And that's a fair question. So as part of this video, I want to explain better how learning and the time spent learning the principles of the topspin forehand apply to learning the other strokes. And you'll learn them in a faster way, I believe, once I've explained this. So you won't be wasting your time spending more time on the forehand. You'll only increase your learning for the other strokes when you would get to them. So you're going to learn a ton of new detail on the wind-up and you're going to learn how all of these details relate to the other strokes. So we have a lot to cover today. Let's get started. So today we're continuing our voyage of discovery to discover the meaning of this outer map and why people do it differently, but there's a similarity underneath of it that we have to discover. And you know, I like historical analogies, so I want to bring forward another one, which is the story of the hieroglyphics on all the artifacts and pyramids and whatnot in Egypt. For 2,500 years, these hieroglyphics were a complete mystery to us. We had no understanding whatsoever of what was going on, what was being said, and there was vast quantities of these to read, but we couldn't read them. So why is that important? Well, the Egyptian civilization lasted for 3,000 years before the Greek and Roman civilizations that our civilization was based on. So understanding that 3,000 years was really key to understanding our own history. And so finding the meaning to the hieroglyphics was pretty darn important. So what was missing for 2,500 years was a way to interpret these hieroglyphics that seemed like the outer map, if you will. And you can see why this was so important. A much more important discovery than anything Indiana Jones did in his Egyptian adventures. And the key to the hieroglyphics was discovered in 1799 by the French when they invaded Egypt. And the stone was found near the city of Rosetta in Egypt, hence the Rosetta Stone. And so this was the key that was missing all this time, because the stone contained 3 levels of language, all talking about the same thing. The first was the hieroglyphics, as you can see in the slide in the background. Second was a secondary language. And the third was a Greek language, ancient Greek, but we understood ancient Greek very well. And so with the inclusion of these 3 levels, especially the Greek, the Egyptologists were able to start the process of interpreting the hieroglyphics. Now, taking a break from Egyptian history and returning to our series about the kinetic whip forehand. Remember the very first lesson we talked about the kinetic whip, and we talked about cracking this whip and how the whip was the fastest man-made object till the 20th century. So, you know, we're here back talking about Egypt, whips, and discoveries. So I thought I would add my little Indiana Jones hat to this process of understanding. And I agree that the hat is pretty much a prop, right? But the whip isn't. You remember me saying that I wanted our bodies to be more like the handle of the whip, flexible and bending and curving. Remember, we went through those lessons with the body and how we're building up energy into the tail end of the whip eventually, and how we're gonna build in loops and curves and the spiraling action, and we would gradually build up this kinetic energy out to the distal parts of our arm and hand and eventually to the racket, and we'd be cracking the whip as we sling and release and catch the wave here at the end. So it's not that much of an exaggeration to have the Indiana Jones hat and talk about interpreting the outer map of positioning. And it's not so much of an exaggeration to the significance of the discovery. So even though the hat is a prop, you know, the whip is the real thing. And when this whip is cracked, that's no joke. That tip of this whip action is going over 757 miles an hour, breaking the sound barrier. So, given this is really the fastest thing we can produce out of our body, process movements, it's an important principle for us to incorporate from beginning to end into our swinging process. This is how we're going to reach the higher levels of skill. So to interpret the outer map of the take back and wind up to the slot, we can utilize 3 of the principles that we're already familiar with, hopefully, out of all the ones that we've listed. And that is tap into the idea of the kinetic chain, the rotational spiral swing, and the spiral loading and unloading. And here we see in the background the kinetic chain wind-up process from the take back into the slot, focusing on the kinetic chain and the major rotational segments of the body. There are 32 of them. Here we're only listing several. And we see it from the ankles to the pelvis, to the waist, to the chest, to the shoulders. You know, they all have different ranges of rotation and different ranges of rotational speed. And you've seen versions of this before, but I think this will help explain things a little bit better. So we typically we only think of our shoulder and arm as the rotational element, if we think of it rotationally at all. That's our notion of the swing. It's an arm-driven, arm-led swing. The kinetic whip model that I've been teaching changes all that to focusing on the body as a body-led, body-driven swing using the kinetic chain process. And it does, once we inject energy into the ground with a sinking athletic posture and bending of the knees, the energy does tend to rise right through our body, and it rises through our feet, and it rises even through our ankles. We don't think of our ankles as rotational elements, but they do have an important rotational functionality to perform in the kinetic chain. So the interesting thing about this wind up on the hitting side of the body, all the kinetic chain segments in the wind up phase go into external rotation. So from the feet, so this is the face-on view, I'd have an external rotation of this right foot and leg out. So external rotation is away from the midline of the body. So this would be external rotation of my arm, and this would be internal rotation of my arm and shoulder to the midline. External, internal. So the same thing with the foot. External, internal, external, internal. So starting from the ground up, the actual feet below our ankles are also in an external rotation on the hitting side, but we can't really see that. So we can see the step out, external foot placement and rotation. That means an external slight rotation of the knee and the hip, right? Stepping out, taking our weight here. And this is a spiraling up action in our pelvis, as we talked about the other day. It's not just a flat turn in the circle, but we're sort of spiraling up, and our pelvis is sort of shaped in a bowl, so our pelvis kind of spirals up here naturally a little. In addition, all the rest of the upper segments are in external rotation. So my waist, as I turn here, is turning here to external rotation. This would be internal. My ribs, as I said, would be spiraling this way in external rotation. My shoulder complex and the joint in my shoulder is externally rotating. So I'm turning, and the racket is externally rotating from this neutral position. I'm turning it up here like this. Now it's facing out that way. Every single element is an external rotation. Yes, in sequence, and some are going together, but that is a universal process of all swinging and throwing actions. That's why I've been saying that underlying the swinging action is a throwing action. And in all throwing and swinging sports, and I'll show you in a minute, there's this external windup. Back, so you can see my ankles, that the rotation of the ankles take the pushing and initial rotating movement up from the feet, translating it to the knees and the hips. It has 10 or 20 degrees of rotation, and this is extremely important. You may have seen and heard about this, that Tiger Woods, candidate for GOAT golfer, was in an accident 3 years ago, and he almost died. And severe injuries to his right leg and right foot. And part of the surgery process was fusing the ankle bone that gives us the rotation in the right foot and left foot, but his was frozen in the right. And even though he's recovered so well in every other respect, he's really had problems ever since. And that he reports that he has pain in every part of his body but the frozen ankle. That's not giving him pain. But what's happening is that because he doesn't have this rotational ability anymore in his right foot, the rest of the kinetic chain moving up has to take up the slack and take up the extra stress of rotation because he doesn't have that in his ankle. And it's caused a major pain, and it looks like it's going to drive him into early retirement. He just can't seem to get over all this. So if I'm a quarterback throwing a football, I would assume so many of the similarities of our tennis forehand. So I would be in an athletic posture, slightly bent, maybe not as bent as we would start in a forehand, but bent over. So I've got an athletic stance, and I have the ball in front of me like we have the racket in front of you. It's in a neutral position. But now as I start my windup for my football throw, my right foot is going to step out in an external rotation, which means my knee and hip are also, as I start to receive weight into my right side of my pelvis. And then as I take the football back, my ribs, chest, elbow, wrist are all in external rotation. And I'm lifting like we do in the tennis racket. And I've shifted most of my weight to the back. So all in external rotation. The frisbee throw. Again, I start in a neutral position, but if I'm gonna do a forehand frisbee throw, I would have an external step out to the right, weight shift back here. I would have my right hip and knee turn slightly out, right? And then I'm gonna lift up and spiral my arms and hands in external rotation, shoulder in external rotation as I wind back. And even as I drop into the slot, the maximum loaded position, I'm winding externally with my shoulder. And my hand and my wrist are all laid back to this direction. Internal rotation would be the other way. So in the release part of the throwing and swinging action, so the throwing action and the swinging action can be broken into two simple phases. There's an external rotation, and then there's an internal rotation. There's a wind up, and then there's a release. So once we are wound up in maximum external rotation on our hitting side, then everything on the hitting side is going to go in reverse into internal rotation. So starting with the hips, starting to unwind, my right trail hip, my hitting hip, is rotating internally. My knee is rotating internally. My hip is rotating internally. My waist, chest, upper complex are all rotating internally, right? And the joint in my shoulder, the fastest joint in our body, 7,200 revolutions per second. This is where we get the tremendous One of the reasons the tremendous speed as we release. So we've gone from external rotation, and then the body starts to unwind, followed by the kinetic sequence all the way up to the shoulder and out to the arm with the racket lagging. But all this is now, once I've started the throw forward, all of this is internal. Every single element, hand, wrist, shoulder, chest, everything is internal rotation. And being pulled by the body in this release. It's the same release throwing process with the football. So if I'm the quarterback and I've gone into external windup and gotten all the way back to basically the slot position in football, so I'm totally wound up here in external rotation. Point of the football is backwards from the target here. And then everything is going to go in the same sequence, led by the unwinding of the lower body and internal rotation on the hitting side. Foot, knee, hands, chest, arm, followed by the release of the arm and the pronation of the hand. Frisbee, the same way. I've wound up in external rotation. Now I'm going to go into the forward throwing action. Everything starts from the lower body first. Again, everything on the hitting side is now going into internal rotation, pushing and driving in internal rotation and releasing in this tremendous slingshot, slinging action that we've talked about. So understanding the foundational principle of throwing in the kinetic chain, we can have a greater assurance that the time and energy we're putting into learning something is based upon the best principles, the principles that science in all of these sports has documented. This is the wave chart, the kinetic sequence, the measurement of speed as the waves of energy pass through our body up the chain, getting faster and faster. Perhaps on a more practical level, understanding the correlation between throwing and swinging helps you understand sort of what you should focus on, which is you should be focusing mostly on the body in your swinging motion. And you should be focusing on the different parts of the kinetic chain and not ignoring them. So in order for the swing to happen smoothly, this energy has to pass, sequentially and smoothly up through the chain. So if any part of the body is too stiff or too weak, not flexible enough, you have an energy leak in that process and things stall out. And then you try to make it up later on with an arm swing, but it never really works. So it has big implications to understanding where you might focus your training and fitness and gaining more flexibility. Ankles could be a good place to start. Most people have way too stiff in ankles. It makes it very difficult to have a high level topspin forehand swing, and especially very difficult to have a serve motion if your ankles are too stiff and you can't flex and turn and rotate as you should. So, and you can also chunk up your swing this way. So some part of the kinetic chain is really letting you down. You don't really have any sense of rotation in your waist, for example. It's important that we have twisting in the waist area where we don't have a lot of muscles, but the twist is very important. You can focus some practice time and some fitness time on those things. And viewing these videos, as I said, they can be very detailed at times, and you don't want to get overwhelmed with the detail and lose the sense of the big picture the first time you're watching it. You can let some of the smaller details go and see if you're really grasping the big picture, and then go back to them and work on different segments and chunks. And as I've been teaching you and showing you, when we start to analyze movement and create a movement map, we have to break it into chunks because it's just too overwhelming to do the whole thing. So in this area where we're talking about the take back and the drop into the slot, the wind up, if you will, we can look at it, if we look at the old goats, the big three, Djokovic, Federer, and Nadal, they sort of do this in three phases that we'll go into. The next generation does it in 2 phases, and we'll discuss that as well. So I wanted to cover this in more detail because I've seen and heard from some students who are showing me that they really don't quite get this whole wind up and take back very well. So I've tried to be even more micro-specific in this particular lesson. So if we start in an athletic posture, we're in a neutral, we don't know where the ball is going, left or right, forehand, backhand, right? And so have nice, sometimes they spin the racket because they don't have a grip yet, but once the player recognizes it's going to be a forehand, you know, among the first things they do is a grip change, you know, to hopefully Western, or most of the pros now, Western or semi-Western. And this grip change is the first sort of hand and arm and shoulder movement of external rotation. So if I'm neutral here and I'm externally rotating my hand and elbow and shoulder this way to turn the racket here, that's external rotation. So this may help you sort of understand the process and do it a little bit more crisply. And there's also a step out of an external rotation of the foot. So we're doing something like this, and we're starting to lift and spiral up our arms in external rotation, our chest and our ribs and our hitting shoulder anyway, up here. And all of that is an external rotation. So what are the problems that people have is I see that, remember we talked about the upper swing center and the lower swing center, but the swing center in the middle of our chest, in the middle of our body up here, and how we need a centered turn, a rotational turn around that center. So from the very beginning, we have to, especially when we're practicing and learning, we have to have some focus that we're turning around the center point. We're not moving our arms out here or just turning our body out here, which is how almost everyone else takes the racket back. They're sort of out here and let their arms and things drift, and they sort of drop them here. That's really not a good start to this whole process. So we start with the external grip change, and usually the goats are that bring up the racket a little bit here, close to their body. It's not out here. They're not dropping out here already. They're still close to the body. External rotation. Elbow kind of pivots in here as the shoulder internally rotates. And when they pick up this racket and bring it up into the take back position, the racket is usually coming up pretty vertical compared to the midline of their body, so they're not way out here. You really can't wind up your body starting out way out here, but if you externally rotate here around the center and you lift your elbow and arms up here, now you're starting to look like the goats. This is Djokovic, you know, this is more like Federer, and Nadal is more like this. The racket is lifted slightly behind the head or a little bit further, depending on who's doing it. But it's not here, it's behind the ear and behind the head. That's sort of the pause position. But the whole thing is much more vertical and much more of an external rotation around the center than people think it is. And it will seem quite surprising to you to practice this and to feel this sharp internal rotation around the center instead of letting the arms and the body kind of fall to the side and make a slow turn, which really doesn't load the body. We are loading the body and spiraling up here. So it's not totally loaded, but we are loading. And here I'll play a video of the big three, just doing phase one of this from the ready position, this take back. And I'll pause the video at the take back spot so you can really focus in on just this move, the spiraling up move, much more vertical, much more of an external rotation around the center. And you can see for yourself how they do it. So in the next phase, from phase 1 of the old goats, from this first initial take back position, the old goats seem to have this inner transitional phase where they're pretty much just sort of dropping the racket down at the level of contact. And they do it in different ways. For Djokovic, well, before I cover that, so the purpose of this is, even though we have the racket and arm sort of close by our head here in this initial take back position, we can't really swing effectively from there. We need width away from our body. We have to take our arms and racket away from the body, and we have to extend the racket behind us that gives us the depth that we want. So there's this stretching and expansion of our body form, which we'll bring in, but we need the stretch and extension. And you almost never see this with recreational players. They don't have any width, you know, away from their body. They sort of drop the racket just by the side, and they don't have any depth behind them. So this very much limits their ability to load and release the racket. So we want width and depth in our windup. And so we take it from the initial take back position, and then if you're Federer, you know, you're sort of just dropping it to the side with the racket tip forward into the famous or infamous tap the dog's head position that other pros say, well, everyone should do it that way. Well, I don't agree with that at all. It's just the way Federer does it, and it works for him. But Djokovic is different. So he's up here, and he's taking it back with a much more vertical drop, and the orientation of the racket sort of goes out to this direction as he drops. And so there's a reason for that, is because as he gets down here, he's going to pivot this racket down into the slot, but we'll get to that. Now Nadal does something totally different than those two. So his take back is the racket sort of angled back here, and there's a loading of this lower section of the lat and elbow and arm as he gets into this position. And then he kind of drops it down very low and straight, vertical, still pointed out to the slight back side fence, but he's just dropping it down here. We'll see how he drops into the slot. So you can do this in different ways if you decide that you want to follow the old goat model, which would be a good model. They're great players. Well, we'll talk about the next generation in a moment. But first, look at phase 2 of the old goats, this move from initial take back to the dropping of the racket. It's a pretty short and simple move, but I want you to be able to isolate and look at that as well. Now the third phase of the old goat forehand windup is the drop into the slot. So after the racket, Federer has his racket in the tap the dog position down here, tip slightly forward, maybe back here a little bit more than I'm showing. And he's going to wind this, keeping the racket strings facing the ground, wind this back into the slot depending on what kind of shot he has. There's sort of this winding. The video I'm going to show you, he has kind of a high shot, so he's just going up here and going forward, not going deep with a deep bend. But if it's a low ball, this winding involves as we talked about, a side bend and a folding in of the elbow, then close to the hitting hip, which will eventually go through as we release the racket. But we're still all in external rotation with everything. So Djokovic is out here, he extends out here, and then as he folds into the slot, he loops the racket down and back depending on what kind of stroke. On the one I'm going to show you, he just sets a little bit back here because it's a high ball and he doesn't have much time, so it's more like that. And Nadal has his already way down here. Racket tip is pointed, you know, to the side fence and back, but then he'll just Then he's loading into the slot with an external final rotation of his arm, cocking motion of his wrist and forearm, etc. Then he's in the maximum loaded position. So that's really the most important phase of this wind up, is this drop into the slotting position. That's where we're maximum loaded, maximum external rotation on the hitting side. And that's what you want to keep focusing on. Keep working on your hand width and depth, and the folding in, the bending, and the beginning of a weight shift into your lead side, as we talked about, with a recentering bump to your forward side. And a syncing here, where we're going to be gathering our energy into the ground for the push and drive out. Now I'll play you the video of the big three executing phase 3 and then the release into the swing. Remember, the release will be all an internal rotation. So as you watch this, you can watch the last part of the external rotation and then watch the beauty of this spiraling internal rotation. So now looking at the next gen forehands, and I should be showing you an example of Jack Sock, which I believe is a GOAT candidate, and he represents sort of the next generation, but you can think of any number of top male players now: Sinner, Alcaraz, Rublev, Rune, Kyrgios, all have pretty great forehands. We don't know if they'll be, eventually in the same level as our first 3 GOATs, but who knows? Alcaraz already has 4 Grand Slams at age 21, and Djokovic didn't get 4 Grand Slams till he was 24. So it's possible, but we're not going to get into those kind of disputes. So what key do we need to interpret the next generation wind up on the topspin forehand? Well, we have to realize that it only happens in 2 phases. So there's the take back of Sock, and we see a different form that we'll talk about. I'll play the Sock forehand in the background here as we sort of talk our way through it. You can see that he has a much more tilted and bended and twisted form than the old GOATs. And this is somewhat symptomatic of many next generation players, particularly like Sinner, for example. He's like 6'5", but he's in this crouchy position for his forehand. More athletic posture, I believe. So what are the potential advantages of this next gen forehand as exemplified by Sock? Well, you could think of it as more efficient, since they're skipping this intermediate dropping of the racket phase, going right from the take back position to the slot position. And it, in that sense, it could be more compact, more efficient, and I think it is in many respects. You could also say that this bending and twisting form gives them more whip-like power, more speed, and possibly more spin as well. And we see tremendous speed and spin on all of these players, not that the old GOATs don't have it. And particularly we see in this 2-phase take back is we see a much more dynamic and sharper swivel from the swivel of the racket, from the tip being forward and somewhat in the take back, to the reversal, as they reach the slot. And you can see that Sock has this wavy form, makes it smooth, and the energy flows in that continuous loop of energy that we talked about the other week. This is another advantage for speed and power, potentially, and I think it is. I've experimented with all of these styles, and I've have incorporated a lot of these ideas into my swing, and I think it's made it more powerful and efficient. You know, but I also practice the old goats method, and those work as well. I'm just saying, don't dismiss the next gen just because they haven't won as many Grand Slams yet as the old generation. Before we go to the end part of this movement map lesson, where I'm going to talk about how the principles that we've learned in the forehand apply to other strokes, particularly the one-handed backhand, I want to go back to the historical analogy of the Rosetta Stone. So the father of Egypt studies, this guy named Jean-Francois Campion, he had the stone, he had the key, had the 3 levels of language, but it still took him 23 years to decipher these hieroglyphics. So the question is why? And the answer is, it was complicated. It took him 23 years to figure out that there are 4 levels of interpretation to these hieroglyphics. They could be interpreted phonetically, conceptually, historically, or religiously. And they could be read in 4 different directions. We only lead from left to right. You can read hieroglyphics left to right, right to left, top to bottom, and bottom to top. So pretty complex, right? And it took him 23 years to figure all that out. I think the analogy holds to some degree, as we've been covering the topspin forehand for, you know, several weeks at least, even into the months, with now the 11th major lesson. And so why did we have to spend all this time to do that? And I would say it's basically the same explanation. It's complicated. You can see all the major inner key principles of the inner map that we've covered, and getting to a level of understanding and skill development on each of these takes quite a bit of time. So it is complicated. But the other major reason that it's complicated is that these inner principles and the key outline that I just showed you is still a map. It's still an outline of a complex physical process. And the map is not the territory. Until you have actually engaged in the physical practice of these skills, the deliberate physical practice, you really aren't walking the land as you need to really truly understand. And engaging in deliberate practice on all these different principles does take time. And it's a journey. But that's really when you discover and experiment for yourself whether these things are true or not. You have to prove all of these things out to yourself. You can't just watch a video, get the intellectual information, and say, okay, I've read the 11 principles, I'm ready to go on now. It doesn't work like that. You have to engage, and you have to do deliberate practice. Yet I know that some of you have written me and posted and said, you know, Kim, I appreciate everything you do on forehand. I'm learning some things, you know, but I do have other issues in my life. I do have in my tennis life, I do have serve and I have backhand issues in particular. And when are you going to get to them? And I understand we will get to them. But I want you to understand that you're not wasting your time spending to learn the principles and the feels and the movement map on the topspin forehand. Because these same principles can be applied to other strokes, particularly the backhand, which I'm going to show you in a minute, and the serve, as well as some of the other strokes. So if you spend some time and energy learning the principles of the topspin forehand and the feels and the movement map, once we move on to the other strokes, your learning cycle is going to be accelerated. You're going to know what spiraling up and spiraling down and what the wave is and the slinging feeling and all these things that are going to be applicable in these other strokes. So by no means are you wasting your time, and we'll be put to good use, and I'll show you this shortly in terms of the backhand. Since we just had a detailed lesson on the wind-up on the topspin forehand side, I'll show you using the same ideas and principles and feels on the one-handed backhand side. So we start from a ready position, same athletic posture, neutral. Okay, and our first movement is In the backhand topspin, one hand is a mirror image of the forehand side. So what's our first thing going to do is a rotation of the racket into the internal rotation of our shoulder, arm, and hand slightly into an Eastern grip. And we're going to lift the racket with both arms vertically, just like this. And we're going to step out with our left leg and turn internally with our right hip in this coiling position. So everything goes into internal rotation from the hitting side on the one-handed backhand in the backhand. So my hip, knee, and foot on the hitting side are all rotating internally. My chest, my stomach, my upper thoracic spine, my ribs are all spiraling up, internally rotating. My shoulder joint is internally rotating. All opposite. The hands, the racket, everything is internally rotating up in this spiral action. Much the mirror image, and we're still taking the spiral and the take back around the swing center in the middle of our chest. So we're not going around here like this. We're turning with a sharp internal rotation and Eastern grip change here, and we're lifting and spiraling up the racket in a very vertical way close to our head. So you get, and we'll take Stan Wawrinka, who's here, who's obviously a candidate for the GOAT one-handed backhand as our model. So he's turning and he's lifting. He doesn't lift as high as some people are in the forehand, but he's lifting up here, and he's moving the racket behind him a little bit, behind his hitting shoulder a little bit in the first take back phase, but it's basically the same spiral up. Now, one of the changes from the forehand to the backhand side is the orientation of the body, and this is be very important. So on the forehand side, we're close to the target, maybe 20, 30 degrees, and we're gonna rotate through. So our lead shoulder is angled out in some manner, depending on what kind of stroke, but it's usually closed and angled off. On the backhand side, it's much more rotational. So the turning of the body, eventually the pivoting of the body, not all the time, but in most strokes, and the one you'll see, is that our lead shoulder is not angled, perpendicular to the target line, but is angled from the target line 30 to 60 degrees back here. So this is angling my lead shoulder at you, the target. But then as I turn and coil and orient my body more, you can see that showing you, if I had numbers on the back of my back here, you would see those very clearly as I coil around, and my right foot is planted out in this 67 degree target area. Well, what's the reason for that? Very important reason is that most players, recreational players, they're taking their arms back. They're not giving their arms any space for the width and depth that we were talking about on the forehand side. So their arms and hands are all cramped in here. There's no space for the drop of the arms. So I'll show it from this direction. So once I've turned here and angled off, target is this way. Now I have all this space. I can just drop my arms and loop it down into the slot. I have so much more room, so much more freedom of action for the width and depth that we went on the backhand. And I would bet 95% of you are not orienting your body close off enough to the target to give yourself this room to drop your hands down and back to the side. This is one practical thing that you could take away from even the short backhand lesson. And for the one-handed backhand, even from the older generation, it's usually a two-phase wind-up. So there's the initial turn and coil and raising of the arms and extension back. And then in the second stage, there's even a deeper orientation of the body close from the target and a dropping and winding, spiraling down of the hands in the backhand. But the spiral action is very similar to our forehand side back there. We're spiraling back and we're side bending just the way we did on the forehand. We're creating space for this arm drive out on an inside out path. And we're giving a little bump into our lead hip, shifting our weights, lowering our center of gravity. So we're spiraling down and in, spiraling down and in, winding the racket back in internal rotation. All these are in internal rotation, just like on the forehand side, all were external rotation. So we're all wound back in the slot. We sunk in, side bended, and now we're talking about the release of the swing, which we'll eventually go into and talk about in the future. But I just wanted to cover the wind up on the forehand and the backhand side and see that I've even kept almost all the words from the forehand wind up in the backhand wind up, except I've changed one word mostly. External on the forehand, internal wind up on the backhand. So once we get a feeling and an understanding on the forehand side, once we get to this backhand in more detail, you're going to get it a lot faster. Play now a couple loops of the Wawrinka one-handed backhand and forehand. First the backhand, then the forehand, then the backhand, the forehand, with the tracing on with the hand, so you can see the hand path and the racket path are mirror images of each other. You can see that all the principles that we've talked about on the forehand, the athletic posture, the throwing principle, so we're going to be throwing on edge of this racket, and external rotation in our release on the backhand side. So it's internal wind up, external release. We're going to be pulling the racket with our body's motion and letting the racket lag behind, just like we did on the forehand side. We're going to use the kinetic rotational energy of our hips and body as mostly our engine of our power, letting the arms be heavy and lagging behind us and relatively passive. And the action that we want, the spiral up and to square up so that we can direct the ball where we want, will happen on its own with the right form and the right whip action, which of course is part of our whole whip model. And we'll also have the spiraling up on the backhand side that we saw on the forehand side. We're getting to the end of this movement map lesson, but before we get to the end, I want to sort of wrap up the story on the Rosetta Stone. So what happened to the Rosetta Stone? So if the French discovered the Rosetta Stone and a Frenchman interpreted it, how come the Rosetta Stone is now in the hands of the British in the British Museum? The answer to that is that when Napoleon invaded Egypt around the turn of the 1800, the British defeated him in Egypt, and as part of the treaty peace settlement, they demanded that the French turn over the Rosetta Stone to them, and the French had to do it, and the British put it in the British Museum, and they've kept it there ever since, and it doesn't appear that they're going to be giving it back. So is that really fair that the French discovered the Rosetta Stone and a Frenchman spent 23 years interpreting it and deciphering it and translating it, but the British get to keep the Rosetta Stone in their museum? Is that really fair? Well, to give this just a little bit of a tennis twist answer, I would say that it seems like from the antics of so many players now on the tour, where they're breaking rackets and crying and breaking up when they get a bad call from the umpire, you know, things aren't always fair, right? And they should take the wisdom of the great Egyptian scholar and baseball player Yogi Berra, who said, if the world were perfect, it wouldn't be. We're now in the deliberate practice section of the lesson. This is the how-to part of the lesson. And as usual, I want to ask you to be cautious about exercising if you're not fit and proper to exercise. And I have my list of checklists here in the background that I'll read. Is don't do these exercises as if you're injured or sore. Stop the exercises immediately if you have any pain. Do all the exercises properly in athletic posture, so you're not twisting and bending something that you shouldn't. And start all of these slowly, you know, feel your way into the movement before you go into something very fast. The overall theme of this lesson has been syncing the outer and the inner map, with particular focus on the wind-up phase of the stroke. We've had a lot of lessons about release, the flinging and the catching the wave, and that's all great. But here we're working on this phase that seems to be giving so many people problems, which is the wind up to the slot. And so we'll be looking at the big three as we did in the movement map, and looking at the phases that they did it and seeing if we can move to a higher level of skill on this wind up phase. Particularly, I want you to focus on one concept as we move throughout all of these, which is loading. So I want you to forget about this unit turn, which is basically the wrong message to send to your brain to even think about it. From the minute we're in a ready position, we should be thinking loading. And that's the thing that's missing in so many recreational players' swing. As I've said, until you load, you can't unload. So we have to deal first things first. Let's really focus on loading. I don't care about the release and hitting and where the ball goes and all that. Once we get to that section, it's all your focus. It's all about loading, hopefully for the next couple of weeks while you're practicing this. In this first exercise, I want to focus on some of the finer details that we really haven't focused on, even in our first issue, which is assuming an athletic posture. And as I've seen other students, you know, demonstrate to me what they think we're doing, none of them really assume a deep enough athletic posture. And so that's what I want this first exercise to focus on. So I want you to focus on that you're gonna hinge at the hips and into about a 30-degree tilt like I'm showing you here. But I want you to feel like there's some pressure in your quads, that your knees have flex and you're able to bounce up and down, and you're feeling those quads as you set up here in this. And I want you to feel that your butt is more down than it normally might be. So as your butt goes down, your back will kind of straighten into a more slanted line without any big curving. We don't have a big curve this way, but with our butt down, we have a slight curve in our back, but our back looks more like this just straight plane. And you can look at the goats, you can look particularly at Djokovic, you know, who's really way down, or Nadal. But you know, we really need to, you know, get in that mode of being, and that really loading begins with the athletic posture. You know, so if we're standing here, that's not the athletic posture. We're standing here, that's not the athletic posture. Down here, butt down, pressure into the legs, bouncing, and we're being able to shift our pressure from side to side like you see them waiting for a return of serve. So that's the first exercise. I want you to do it 10 different times with a pause in between, and think about each time, did I really get down there deep enough? Did I have all those components, have a real ready posture? Now I'll pause the video for you to do that. Now that we've worked on our athletic posture a bit, and we're feeling more dynamic and shifty moving, that I want us to practice phase one of this wind up, which, as we went through several ways with the goats, that the first movement from this sort of deep athletic posture is going to be a change of grip to Western, from neutral to Western or semi-Western, hopefully. And we're gonna be raising up the racket here in the midline of our body, and we're gonna have a external rotation of our hand and shoulder joint. So we're just going like this, but we're starting to raise this, and we're stepping out with our right foot and transferring 70% of our weight to our right side, to our trail side. Now, what you'll find is that if you're in this deep athletic posture and you're 50-50, and if you're not doing any shifting, is think about stepping out to the right when you have both feet weighted. It's virtually impossible. So in this shifting mode, we have to have a shift into this left foot. We don't want to sway like I maybe just demonstrated, but a shift where the pressure and the weight is transferred into the inside of your foot and leg here, so that you can have the other one unweighted and step out. So that's the first move. I want you to just do 10 slow motion reps of this. Ready posture, bounce back and forth, and then at one bounce to the non-hitting side, and then lift and change grips, step out. Part way, we're not going all the way yet. I'll pause the video for you to do 10 slow motion reps. You're refining that process each time you do a rep. In this next exercise, I want you to do 10 reps again, but complete the phase one of the take back, which is from the ready posture and going all the way up to handbrake. Won't worry right now of which model you choose, but I want you to focus on a couple things. So, as I mentioned in the movement map, people want to take their arms away to the side over here in some manner or form and just sort of drop them there. There's no loading, and we're nearly not in a position to get the width and depth that we want. So in phase one, we're just trying to get our arms and body in that position where we can get depth and width. So we're in the ready position. We go through the initial turn, and then I want you to keep focus on a sharp external rotation of your shoulder joint here, so that the racket is coming up close to your head, not way out here. So we're turning the racket face up, and then we're going to lift and end in a position where the racket is slightly behind our trail ear in some manner or form. It can be high or low, I don't really care, but I want it to be high and I want it to be deep. And I want it to be close to your head, not out here. So that's phase one, all the way from the ready position. And I'll pause the video for you to do 10 slow motion reps. Keep refining and perfecting that movement. Pause. So now I want you to do phase two of the old GOAT model. Remember, they have 3 phases: the take back, the drop, and then the move into the slot. So this next exercise is I want you to go from the ready position up to your handbrake position up here, high and a little bit further behind your head. And then I want you to think about that you're going to be hitting a ball at your belly button level, so not real low, but fairly low, because I want you to have to be able to drop the racket down low enough and get some side bend so that you can hit a topspin on the shot. It's about right here. I don't want the ball to be thinking about it's up here, then you'll just stand there and do something like this. So we're hitting a fairly low ball, which means that from this handbrake position, I'll show you this way, is that I want to drop my racket, if I'm a big 3 GOAT, down to the level of my contact. in just the dropping. So if my contact point is at my belly button, I want this racket to be dropped at least to that level, not up here, not way down there. We have other things that we can do to lower the racket head as on the release that we've talked about, but basically that's the goal, is drop the racket down to the level of the belly button. And again, we'll do 10 slow motion reps from the ready position, up and drop. We won't worry about which model we're covering right now, but I'll pause the video. In this next sequence, we are going to do a little bit more copying and modeling. It's kind of hard to do this without having some sort of model in your mind. So I want you to use the Roger Federer phase 3 move. So his racket drop into the slot, and we went through it, but I want you to take you through it again from this angle as the target. So if I'm in my ready position as Roger, I'm not worried too much about the first two phases. I'm really looking for this racket drop in a particular way. So I'm spiraling up, and I have my strings sort of 3/4 down here a little bit, but I have them high behind my head as my hands start to break. And then I'm extending my arm back down here, and my strings are facing the ground, and my tip is pointed somewhat forward. So, and I'm lowering myself at the same time, bringing the whole body down, and I have this bend and this setup to swivel the racket in that famous tap the dog, head of the dog position that so many people talk about and recommend. It works for Roger. It's a good thing to practice, good thing to model. So that's what we're doing. So we want to make sure that, you know, as we break, we sort of keep this dropping deeper and keep the form of this drop of our whole body behind us, tip forward. And then phase 3 is just going to be the winding of this with the racket strings down into the slot when we're hitting a ball at our belly button. So his racket pivot is going to be about at the level of our belly button. So it's here and then winding there to, that's the maximum wind up, Roger Federer style. You work your way through it slowly, 10 reps. I'll pause the video for you to do that with Roger Federer. So don't worry about it if you don't feel like you're getting it that time on the first time through. Again, these exercises are all designed to be done over several days and weeks, day by day, 15 minutes a day perhaps. And the great thing about deliberate practice is that most of this is done on your own, in your bedroom, in your garage, in your backyard. And I really don't advise you to be telling all your tennis buddies that you're building your Roger Federer forehand, because believe me, it will be met with only skepticism and mockery. It's really none of their business. This is your business. You don't need to talk about it with anyone, just need to do it. So now that we've sort of gone through a little bit of the Roger Federer version, I want you also to have some experience following the Novak Djokovic model, which is going to feel quite a bit different. But this is the way we learn these new feels, as we sort of put ourselves out there that way. So from the ready position, again, we're going to be down, feeling our butt down, our shifting, and we're going to feel a very vertical rise with an external arm rotation, shoulder rotation, and lifting of our arms very directly high over our head. And for Djokovic, he's going to have the racket quite a bit behind him, so the tip of the racket is you know, probably going to hit him in the back of the head if he were going to do that. And the strings are facing the sky. So this is a much higher lift than Roger. And the arms are already much more extended, and the wrist is sort of angled back this way. So that's phase one. And from the ready position, much higher lift, strings to the sky, racket behind us further than Roger. I'll pause the video for you to do phase one of Djokovic. Now moving along to the Djokovic model phase, second phase of the wind-up, which is the dropping of the racket, again, hitting a ball around our belly button. So this, again, if the target's here and I'm up here like Djokovic, now I'm going to be dropping the racket more straight down, vertical like this, with some orientation out to my right. So the racket's going to be more out here and down, maybe not quite as far as down as the waist level, because he usually has this sort of dropping pivot that I want you to practice. But from here, it's mostly back, but then some element of dropping to the right, so that the arm and the racket are cocked up like this, angled out to the right. That's phase two. From the ready position, okay, I want you to practice that 10 slow motion reps. I'll pause the video. Now the last phase, the most important phase of the wind-up, of course, is the drop into the slot. And one thing you might notice already is with the arms lifted so high and stretched out, you already feel maybe there's a more potential energy in this wind-up of Djokovic. I certainly do. Roger generates his power sort of slightly different. We won't go into that. But Djokovic is really using the stretch and the height of his arms and giving himself a lot of depth and width in this drop back here, so that he can then do this pivot. And the pivot and the swivel of the racket will be more at the level of contact. And so from the ready position, I want you to do all three phases of the Djokovic wind-up. High take back, drop to the side and right, and then the sinking and the pivot and the winding back of the arm. So we're feeling this external rotation in all parts of our hitting arm, down to our wrist, which is cocked back. So I'll pause the video for 10 slow motion reps of all three phases of the Djokovic wind-up. Now in this lesson, I'm not going to go through the Nadal sequence, but I'm going to give you that as a homework assignment, that you're going to go through the same series of repetitions with the Nadal phase one, phase two, phase three, and bottle them all up. So it's something to be worked out over the next days and weeks. So like we usually go after we haven't hit balls, we eventually move out to the court, and now you're taking this video out to your court with your training partner or ball machine. And again, we're having your partner just feed balls, so that you just have to take one step out or half a step. We're not looking for movement, we're looking for focus on swinging, and particularly we're focused on this take back phase of the stroke. So I don't want you to think about the release, where the ball goes, how much topspin. I really don't care about the effect at this point. I want all the focus to be on loading, and whether you got through all three phases. And in order to actually hit balls, we're going to have to do this probably much faster than we've been showing in slow motion, obviously. So from ready position to slot is probably 0.6 seconds, the whole stroke taking 1 second. So we're going to have to work on speeding everything up, but still not missing out on any of the phases. And each time you do a rep, you have to really think, did I skip one phase, or did I skip through it too quickly? Did I get my racket drop deep enough? Did I get, you know, the sinking swivel and the coiling of the arm? So I want you also in this hitting exercise, I do want you to imitate the goats that we've been looking at. So for the first exercise on the court, I want you to hit 20 topspin forehand shots like Roger Federer. So I want you to, you know, follow the Federer model as well as you can, and giving some pause between each hit, you know, seeing if you can refine it, feeling, you know, some of that effortless smoothness that Roger could put into a stroke. I want you to try to feel that as well. But more than anything, I want you to think loading, and that you completed all 3 phases of the loading. I'll pause the video for Roger now. So the next 2 series of hitting exercises, 20 balls each, will be the Djokovic model and the Nadal model. We don't need to walk through that here. It's just your homework assignment, how you're going to carry out. And, you know, try to feel what the differences are for you in these 3 models. You know, do you feel more energy with Djokovic? Or do you feel maybe this loading that Nadal does, where he loads his elbow inside, you know, that was the right way to go. Over time, I've tried these for weeks and weeks at a time, and various times I've thought that one model or another was the right one, but let me talk about that in a moment. So this lesson today is all about syncing the outer and inner map, and learning, especially in the wind-up phase, learning new principles and feels to sync up, you know, these ideas that we have about the wind-up with the outer form of the big 3 goats. And, you know, this is basically the way I started this process as well. I wanted to hit my forehand like Roger Federer, my hero, and I copied his form, and I made some progress doing that. And then it didn't quite seem right at times, and I thought, well, maybe I should try something else. And so I went to the Djokovic form and had that for a few weeks, and for a while I thought, I found it now, Djokovic, I don't need to go any further. But eventually I ran into some issues there too, so then I said, well, let's go to Nadal. And again, I felt like, well, Nadal's form does it all for me, I don't need to go any further. But then there became issues with that as well. So what I'm telling you is, you know, don't fall in love with one model too soon. When you don't fall in love too soon, you avoid this good enough thinking plateauing that happens when we develop a skill, where we develop a skill to a certain point, and then we say somehow in our mind, that's good enough to get what I want, and I don't need to develop that skill any further, and we stop improving. So we want to see if we can avoid that mentality as we go along. So I call this channel Goat Tennis, because I think more than anything, more than technique or anything, it's really the spirit of the goats that I want you to learn about. And I think that spirit is, they have resisted the temptation for this good enough thinking, reaching a plateau and saying, okay, I'm number 1 in the world, I won a Grand Slam, and that's good enough, and rest on my laurels. They never did that. And that's exactly the reason that they did become goats, is they never said this is good enough, and they still never say that. So I'd like you to consider that idea. I know it's not something that you necessarily can jump on board fully. You have to give it some thought. But in the meantime, in the day-to-day journey here, I would say that the biggest reward that you're going to get is sort of the experience of learning a new level of skill, a new feel. That's what I feel with many days of practice, not all of them, but enough that it's very encouraging feeling that, hey, you know, I didn't understand this before, couldn't do this before, but now I can have a better way to do it, a better feel, and it's quite rewarding. So that's what I would recommend that you focus on for now, is see if you can get to a new level of skill, a new feel, and enjoy that journey up to the mountain. Don't think about the plateaus or the peaks so much. Just enjoy the journey, and I think that'll serve you in good stead.